So again, Ben will be on in just a little under an hour, and until then, what we're going to be doing is doing a deep dive into journalism and talking a little bit more about what Nis was talking about regarding uh, what journalism means and what it means to be a journalist and how you can get engaged in the process. And before we go into that too much, I did just want to provide a little historical context of what journalism has meant in the United States so far. And in that line, one of the first things I want to mention is globally, the first newspapers or anything that would be, a document written beyond, the Ten Commandments stone tablet. That's the kind of way that they were done. Is that there was something was etched in stone or on metal or on a building or something along those lines, and it was like a public decree, usually coming from a government or a head official of some sort, in order to disperse information. Then that thing would get read by a few people. Those people would translate it through word of mouth, and that's generally how it existed from BC times, so far as we know on the historical record, anyway. In BC times up until about the 1500s ish, depending on where you're talking about. In Europe, the press started to come along, but in most countries, many countries, it was essentially, again, still an arm of the government, in that it was used to put out propaganda, to make the government's argument to the people. And much of the time, as we know from governments back then, it wasn't in the interest of the people, so it was essentially selling them on something that wasn't going to be actually good for them. And so that's the experience of the press through a lot of history, and I'm sure Nis has some more details on Europe that he'd be happy to provide, leading us into the 17th century. I do want to just give a quick recap, and then I want to come back to each little part to talk about what was going on in each section. And so 1700s, we get the beginning of the United States, or the beginning of the North America as a European country-ish forming. The ideas of an America, of a separate state or a separate country, those things are forming. The media, or the newspapers, the printed word at the time, was generally supportive of being free, being separate from England, being autonomous. That those types of stories, talking about why that was a good idea, and much of the suppression from the crown was to try and stop those types of stories, and to put more stories about why being a subject to the crown was such a good idea and why it was so awesome for everybody there. And so that was the role. Then we get the Constitution, and we go on from there. We're going to talk about the Freedom's Journal, the first black paper in the 1800s, and we're going to talk about a little bit about muckrakers in the 1900s during the Progressive Era, and we're going to get into what it looks like now. But I just wanted to get us into where we're at, or I wanted to get us that far and then start talking. So Nis, sounded like you wanted to pipe in about what was going on in Europe in the early 15, 16, 1700s. If you could provide some perspective on that.
Yeah, like the invention of the printing press, it cannot be underestimated how this invention transformed Europe. Austria was one of the few countries in which they actually immediately recognized it as a threat. Whereas the Catholic Church and other places, they saw it, now we can spread our religion much easier. We can print Bibles faster, and we can do all these things. It's so amazing, it's so great. But they, in the beginning at least, failed to recognize it as a spread of information the other way as well. So before newspapers, theses, even short books, pamphlets, they were published by people walking up to the church or cathedral door, and there were a hammer and nails hanging next to the door. And then you would take your hammer and nail and you would nail it to the cathedral door. This is what Martin Luther King did with his thesis and his Principles of Man. And then some people who had a printing press in the city of Worms took it off the door and mass distributed his thesis via the printing press.
The first tweet going viral.
In essence, one of the early examples of going viral. So you cannot in any way underestimate the transformation of how information was distributed, but also how misinformation was distributed. propaganda, whatever you want to call it. All sorts of information, good and bad, was distributed in completely and entirely new ways. So in Europe, in Sweden, there was a response to a great debate in Europe about the press. And Sweden was the first country in the world, not just Europe, but in the world, to legislate the freedom of the press as part of the constitution. And Denmark and Norway actually followed suit as the next countries. America comes about just about a decade later, I believe. America follows suit with the freedom after the Revolutionary War and the amendments being passed. But so you can say that you guys fought for it tooth and nail to get that amendment, whereas in Sweden it was a part of a debate and a discussion, and of course there were people jailed for it and impoverished off of it, but a whole-scale civil war was not needed to be fought over it. They reasoned it out over some tobacco.
Yeah, which I think leads interesting into, like, so in America we have the idea, like, you know, the Constitution, freedom of press. We made it our First Amendment. It's really important. We love the freedom of the press because it's important for the people to be able to hold our government accountable, and the only way they can do that is if they can freely express their ideas and their opinions, and they can be done in public where other people can view them. And by 1798, we were ready to sign the Alien and Sedition Act. So between 1776 and 1798 was about how long that idea lasted before our government was like, well, you know what? You're saying some things about the government that are just too far out of bounds, and some of them were true and some of them weren't. And I'm sure some people are familiar with the very beginnings of journalism in there and like what some of those papers look like. And so there were some things what we would compare nowadays to tabloids. So, you know, aliens discovered, or Fox, but you know. So, like, there may be a story about, you know, alien sighted over this thing or the other thing, but then there would also be a story that was very legitimate and it was just very cutting. And so the government kind of lumped those two together. And so by demanding that anybody that published anything put their real name and an address that they could find them at, and then making the law that anything that they say was a false statement that was critical of the federal government, which you could imagine now if you gave George Bush or you gave any particular president that authority over the idea of, well, that's false and critical of the government, so it's going to be illegal. You can imagine how that very quickly leads us down a very troublesome path. And so from the very get-go of our country, this has been a battle between what's being censored and what's being spoken about and what each person's mission is. And sometimes the government has honestly and with righteous cause limited the amount of freedom of expression in order to for a greater good. And so one of the examples may be World War II, where dire situations not being reported as being as dire as they were could have been the difference between losing morale or keeping morale so that you keep the fight going. So in extreme situations, there is some justification for it, but again, it leads down a slippery slope, and we've seen in situations during war times where very legitimate press that needs to be exposed doesn't get exposed under the idea that we're protecting ourselves from negative morale. And so that's one thing I really want to make sure that we're clear on, because I know a lot of us think, I know I was taught, and I thought for a long time, that at some point the media, this freedom of press, these ideas were pure, and they just never were. And like it's a weird reference, but I'm gonna make it. In Game of Thrones, one of the things I think that the sociological aspect of it is people are realizing that not everybody's good and not everybody's bad, but that we're all some blend of the two. And so I think that when we realize that media, that the press, that journalism, that these things aren't good and they aren't bad, they're just tools. They just are. And so that we can use media and we can use journalism for good things, and we can use censorship for good things, not yelling fire in a crowded theater. We can use these things for good things, but they can also just as easily be used for bad, sometimes more easily used for bad than good. And it's a struggle that it's not new to us. It's not something this generation is just first grappling with. Not something just in the last 50 years since Cronkite or anything. It's a battle that we've had since we've been able to publicly share ideas beyond conversation. And so I really wanted to drill that home. And the next thing,
if I could just quickly comment. First off, how dare you deface Ned Stark and say that he's not the epitome of everything that's good. Wynter is coming, just so you know.
No
second off, just a little tidbit of knowledge. Like you said, there could be some justification for it during war to preserve morale. Now, I would never condone that kind of censorship to preserve morale. But the National Securities Act, when it's used to preserve life, as in, well, we have deep operatives, and if you expose them, they're going to die. We can't have that. Or if you're going to expose our battle plan that you happen to find out about, then we die. So no, you can't. Like those kinds of situations, okay, I can somewhat get with that. But if you take the UK during World War II, Churchill, in effect, suspended freedom of the press and freedom of speech. He took his political opponent, a person who was a leader of not like it wasn't called the Nazi Party. I forget what it was called. He was pro-Germany. He was pro-fascism, and he took this man and put him in jail. No trial, not even the appearance of a trial. He was just taken out and put in jail, and no one knew of his existence or anything until after the war, when he was, of course, tried for treason. And the press just fell in line behind the government completely, and that's understandable when you suffered heavy losses and defeat, and you're an island completely isolated with a massive and enormously successful at this point enemy surrounding you. Yeah, you want to stand together. So, but still, it has costs. It sets precedents, like Trump citing the internment of the Japanese as precedents for not allowing Muslims to get into the country, and his former opponent, the last guy who dropped out, Ted Cruz, talking about we needing patrols, specifically patrolling Muslim streets. I don't even know what a Muslim street is. Like, are there carpets all over it? But he can point to the vigilantes down at the border of Mexico who are concerned citizens and been portrayed by Fox News as concerned citizens as an example of, well, they did do some attempts to try and curtail their operations, but they gave up and are now tolerating them. So if that's okay, then this must be okay, right?
Yeah, no, I agree with you that the slippery slope and the gray areas become very problematic. And I think one of the things that was mentioned in the Eddie Glaude Jr. video, that one of the parts that I wasn't able to show, was just about how we have to really ask ourselves, what does it take to be good citizens in a democratic country? What are we required to do, and are we meeting those expectations? And I think overwhelmingly the opinion is no. Yeah, that we're not. We're not meeting those. And what he describes in the interview is that we're able to do that by telling ourselves that we're better than we were before. And essentially, and I'm condensing this immensely and probably not 100% accurately, so watch it if you want to know exactly what he said. But it's that we're able to tell ourselves, because we're getting better, because we're not doing that thing we were before, that we are being good, that's being a good democratic citizen. And I think that we haven't, and I think he mentions that we haven't done enough to live up to the ideals that we put forth within the Constitution. And I think that kind of leads well into where I wanted to go next a little bit, into the Freedoms Journal, in about what it is that's required of us in order to participate. And I think what what Professor Eddie Glaude said, and what was being said by uh, the Freedoms Journal back when it was first published, is that we have to engage. We have to. Let me think of the words that I'm looking for here. That we have to be informed citizens in a way that we're able to engage with the very tough and troublesome ideas that we're dealing with. And so what you saw in the early abolitionist movement was an attempt to try and explain what was going on in a way that I think was I don't know, intended to try and be as well received as possible. And I think we've seen a variety of attempts at that in a variety of different ways. And I think that some of the more recent ways that we've seen it come out in journalism has caused some static and stuff among ourselves about what is the right way to move forward about on these different causes, about making these changes that we're talking about. Probably rambled there a bit, but if you followed that a bit, I know we had a lot of this discussion prior.
Okay, so there's actually a related comment from a chat. QNCC says, "This is so random, but their quick talk about censorship reminds me of the Quilimbos, escaped slaves from Brazil who hid their martial arts in a dance, and how slaves had to do things like that on the low key, and because they couldn't train properly." There's also been other examples in Scotland, while under English rule, they had to practice with stones, slings, and big pieces of lumber because they were not allowed to train with weapons. It was a form of control. And we can't kid ourselves. Those who are in power and has been that for some time know that they are guilty. They know that they have misused it. Even those with the best of intentions, they know that they, at the very least, have not spoken out loud enough when they misused it. So they will invariably, the majority of them, will try and curtail as many tools as they can to prevent themselves from being punished, from being found out. So the media has become yet another tool like that. In his latest interview at the Chicago Institute for Policy at the Chicago University, Jon Stewart cites exactly the JFK versus Nixon as the first time that news had the upper hand, let's say, on the politicians. That JFK had like an instinctive thought about, I should wear makeup under these hot lights and while I'm on the camera, and Nixon went, no, I'll be fine. And JFK basically won the election, to quote Jon Stewart, because everyone thought Nixon had herpes. That was a Jon Stewart quote, not an actual fact. That was the last time they had the upper hand. After that, they adjusted. The politicians adjusted, and they turned it on its head. And TV journalism today serves the politicians' interest, the corporatist interest. You go on any webpage of MSNBC and start a video, and you'll invariably, at some point during just doing it 3-4 times, you'll get an ad saying that fracking is safe and good, clean energy, and that everyone else is just a hysteric. Saying that how it gives us a good tax base, and it's everywhere. The money, the influence, the power, wherever they find an outlet that is effective, they will pour their time, money, and influence. And media is one of these things.
Yeah, and on that, I wanted to, before we go too much into the modern era, I want to cover a bit more in depth about what Freedom's Journal was, because I think a lot of us throw back to the progressive era in journalism and think of that as one of the shining times of when journalists were doing great things, and there were. I have a little anecdote. I don't know if you're familiar with the book The Jungle, but it's a funny story about what ends up happening when you do try and uncover these types of things. But before that, Freedom's Journal was the first black-owned newspaper in the United States. It was created by a couple of gentlemen. One of them that I'm going to go into detail about is Samuel Cornish, and he was a Presbyterian pastor. That's kind of how he came up, and he found his way to New York City, just on the outskirts of Manhattan, and there he founded another church. He came from Delaware. He founded another church in New York City, and one of the things that he eventually ended up having, what came up, was when he was talking with theologians and other Presbyterian folks about what was going on in the South and the abolitionist movement, and what that meant to the church, and those types of things. He found that he needed an outlet. He needed a place to tell black people's side of the story, because there were other newspapers in America in the 1800s. There just weren't any other ones being written from the black perspective, or a black perspective for that matter. And so much of what you saw out in the media was essentially, and would be viewed by the black people at the time, as propaganda about sensationalizing every violent act that any black person does, about blaming them for things that they didn't do, attributing, characteristics, or all these types of things were just out as if they were fact, as part of the media, just as easily as the media would tell you what temperature it was going to be today. They would tell you what negative thing the black people in America are going to cause, and it was accepted widely. And so it was very important for black people to have perspective. So one of the few free black men in the country in New York, there was about 13,000, give or take, in this time frame. Depending on who you go for a source, you'll get different numbers. New York City will tell you it was about 2,000. Most black sources will tell you upwards of 10,000 in the 13,000 area, and during the 20s through 50s. And there was a rapid population explosion in New York too. So which years in particular black folks came in aren't exactly well documented in the 1860s and 1820s. Anyway, Cornish goes on, sets up the paper. It's reasonably successful, and with its success, he charges $3 a year for a subscription. That works out to about $75 a year in today's terms, and so it's a reasonably priced, about $5 a month, give or take $5-6 a month. And so that was the model that he did. He also sold small advertisements, 75 cents, and that was how he was able to get his perspective out. And some of the perspectives that they were bringing in, other prominent black abolitionists and other thought makers of the time were expressing their opinions in these papers about why slavery didn't match up with what the Constitution said, what these religious folks were saying, and why that was so problematic. And it caused quite a bit of stir. He was known to be pushing his white brothers and sisters in the church to the place where they were uncomfortable discussing about the intersectionality of religion and reality for black people in America and the Constitution. And so that was I can only imagine what that felt like, being one of very few free black men in the entire country, first off, but then you're in New York City, and you're going to be critiquing white people who, a few hundred miles south could whip you on the back for what you're saying, or do all number of things to you for what you're saying. You're going to go out in public and declare from the top of your lungs and print and spread around as far as you can that you disagree with those people. Here's why they're wrong. And you're not only going to talk about why you disagree with the people that are holding the slaves, but with the people in the North that are allowing it to continue. And that is what that bravery that it takes in order to say to the people that you might pass on the street, what you're doing is part and parcel and part responsible for why they're going through what they're going through in the South, why people are enslaved. Britain has already outlawed this. Much of the world has outlawed this and has realized that what we're doing here is absurd. So the idea that we're both simultaneously holding our Constitution so revered and completely ignoring it for these segments of people is just totally unacceptable. And telling that to the people who would often say that, well, we're on your side, why are you attacking us? why are you attacking? We're on your side, man. And it's like, what? It's like, no. It's like, what you're doing is a part of what is like, by equivocating, by allowing these anti-abolitionist people voices and to treating them as though what they're saying is reasonable and what these slaves are saying is unreasonable. That dynamic is part and parcel of how, and doing that when you're so tediously placed on what you have that it could be taken from you at any given moment is incredibly brave. And I think that also leads to me to what ends up happening later on in New York City, which is Seneca Park. And I don't know how much of our audience is familiar with Seneca Park and Seneca Village and the story of that and how it became Central Park. But a quick explanation of it essentially was one of the few free black communities in New York City in downtown Manhattan was located in part of where Central Park is. It was the largest contiguous group, and it was primarily black. There was an Irish immigration boom shortly before the park, before it became a park, where about a third of the population was Irish, but it was primarily black and a few other immigrants mixed in. And in that, what happened is, at that time specifically, there was 13,000 people, black people in New York, free black people. Of those 13,000, 91 of them could vote. So you had 13,000 people, 91 of them could vote. So much less than 1% of people were able to vote, let alone would, go out and participate. And this is, 1840s, 1850s in the United States, where we're supposed to be getting past a lot of these things, especially in the North, as far as free black people being citizens and being participants in the system. And so with only 10 of them, with only 91 of them, their voice was definitely being silenced. Among that, there was only 10 that lived within Seneca Park, which had a population of between about 250 people. And so 10 of those 250 were able to vote. And the state government decided that, we've been listening to these artists and these poets, and they've told us that a park would be really nice, a nice feature that would help make the community better in New York. So what we're going to do is we're going to turn this part of Manhattan into a big park. And in that process, the people that lived there were like, well, we like living here. That's what we like doing here on this land, and we think that we want to keep doing that. And through eminent domain, which some people may be familiar with, they came in and paid them for their land and kicked them out. They contested, and it was voted on democratically, but as you can tell, only 10 of 250 were able to vote, 13,000 black people in the state, and only 91 of them were able to vote in total. So when you see that these people didn't have a voice. They were silenced out of their democracy, even though since Freedom's Journal, about 40 black papers were being circulated in several states around the country. So they had their voice. They were speaking their voice the best they could. They were doing everything they could to try and make sure that their stories were getting out. But still, we have there in Manhattan that situation. And just to kind of put into perspective what that means long term, why does that matter now? Had, let's just say, a couple of those families managed to maintain possession of their plots, the estimates of what Central Park is worth if you were to build something on it, depending on whether you're counting it as just basic development or the 50-story skyscrapers that are popular in that particular area. If just one little corner had been preserved by one of those black families, we were talking the whole park is worth about anywhere between, the bottom line estimates are about 500 billion, but folks that know what they're talking about put it up closer to about 30 to 40 trillion dollars. So if you figure 1% of that, that's $1 trillion of black wealth that was extracted back then. Give or take, I'm randomly associating these numbers, and they're not precise. But just to give you some perspective about it, so if we want to say 5% or whatever, they occupied a much larger percentage than we're talking about. So if through all the years they only maintained a very small portion of it, we're talking about trillions of dollars of wealth that was extracted from what was one of the premier black communities. They had authors, they had barrel makers, they had professional workers, blue collar workers, white collar workers, they had journalists, they had their own newspapers, they had all of these things that you would expect from black society in order for them to succeed. And the result of that was them getting deprived of everything that they had worked so hard for. And what also happened, besides just being dispersed from that particular place, They were spread throughout New York, and so that sense of community, that black community that existed in New York, was dispersed throughout. And so rather than being a collective community that could work on their interests together, they ended up being separated and ended up dispersed their power and their influence on the situation. So that was my big thing on that I wanted to get out. So from there we can move on to any modern media or anything you want to talk about, Nis. You got it. You are still muted though. Still muted. Still muted.
I thought you were being rude and cutting me off.
Nice to see things haven't changed much.
No, okay, so...
I saw you moving your lips. I wasn't sure if you were talking off camera to Kelly or if you were talking to me and I was ignoring you, but...